Savannah Quinn wasn't supposed to be there that night. Their shift had been taken by someone else. But when a coworker called in sick and the rent loomed like a shadow on her shoulders, she had no choice but to show up, soaked in rain, wearing shoes that pinched, and a heart weighed down by exhaustion. The city was alive with lights and thunder, and inside the lavish Crystal Bloom Hotel, golden chandeliers sparkled above ball gowns and tailored tuxedos, worlds away from Savannah's cramped apartment and secondhand dreams. She balanced the tray with practiced hands, weaving through the murmurs of wealth, her presence invisible among crystal glasses and false laughter. The marble floor gleamed too perfectly, and in a single misstep heel slipping, heart-leaping time unraveled. The tray jerked from her hands like it had a will of its own. Glasses danced mid-air for a breathless second, and then came the sickening chorus of shattering crystal against stone. Gasps rippled through the ballroom like a wave crashing on social decorum. But it wasn't the sound that paralyzed Savannah. It was the feeling beneath her trembling palm, which had instinctively reached out to steady herself, and now pressed against something warm, solid, and unmistakably human. Her eyes lifted, horrified, and met the sharp cut of a jaw that belonged on magazine covers, and eyes the shade of winter skies just before a stormy sea, detached and impossible to look away from. Beckett Hale. The name alone held weight in New York's financial elite. The man himself was even colder than the headlines, a billionaire who built walls from loss and profits from distance. He stared at her, unreadable, and Savannah could hear her heartbeat louder than the murmuring crowd, her cheeks flushing with dread, expecting fury, expecting to be escorted out and blacklisted from every venue that mattered. She braced herself for ridicule, but what came instead disarmed her more than any insult could. 2 words: soft, low, almost tender. "You okay?" The question clung to the air like mist over broken glass. She blinked, unsure if she imagined it. His hand was already reaching down, steadying her elbow, lifting her gently as though she were not a disaster in motion, but someone worth rescuing. Her knees wobbled, not from the fall, but from the unexplainable warmth of that unexpected touch. The tray lay abandoned beside the fractured remnants of the evening, but no one moved. Cameras poised. Faces stared. Savannah could feel the heat of humiliation crawling up her spine. Yet it was his reaction, the absence of rage, the strange presence of concern that left her breathless. She stammered an apology, eyes glued to the floor, waiting for the shoe to drop. For the scolding, the dismissal, the cruelty she'd grown far too used to in a world that never paused for the struggling. But Beckett simply nodded, his gaze unreadable yet no longer sharp. "Accidents happen," he said, with the ease of someone who rarely allowed accidents near him. His voice was gravel wrapped in velvet, controlled, deliberate, yet not unkind. Savannah didn't know whether to run or cry. Around them, murmurs returned, speculation like smoke curling through the crowd, but none dared approach him, and none looked at her with sympathy. She felt like a mistake that hadn't finished unfolding yet. Yet as Beckett turned to walk away, he looked back once briefly, subtly, but it was enough to make her chest tighten. No smirk, no sarcasm, just a glance that felt like a question left unspoken. In that moment, something shifted, not just in her, but in the space between them, an invisible thread pulling tight, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Savannah stood there, ankle aching, pride bruised, but her thoughts miles away from the wine and shattered stemware. She'd touched a man carved in ice sand for a flicker of a second. She thought she felt the ice crack. What she didn't know then was that this night wasn't the end of a shift. It was the beginning of something that would unravel her world, challenge every belief she held about power, wealth, and love. It was the accident that changed everything, not because she fell, but because he caught her. Savannah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shattered glass, the haunting silence, and Beckett Hale's unreadable stare flashing like a pulse behind her eyelids. Morning arrived without warmth, just a dull gray hue bleeding through her cracked window as she stared at her phone bill she couldn't pay, her fridge that barely held anything, and a voicemail blinking like a dare. The voice on the other end was crisp, formal, and impossible to ignore. "Mr. Hale would like to speak with you privately." Her hands trembled as she slipped into her plainest blouse, the one that didn't wrinkle too much and gave the illusion of confidence, even as doubt curled in her chest like a storm about to break. The elevator in Hale Tower moved like silence pressed in steel, climbing toward a man she barely knew, and a future she couldn't fathom. When the doors opened, she stepped into a corridor of glass and marble, greeted by a secretary with sharp red nails and sharper eyes, who led her to an office so large it made her feel microscopic. Beckett stood by the window, back turned, arms folded, gazing out at a skyline she could never afford to touch. "You're here," he said, not looking back yet, his voice lower than she remembered, like thunder muffled behind luxury. She braced herself, heart pounding as if it could shield her from humiliation. But instead of a lecture, he turned, walked toward her, and held out a sleek black envelope. "Open it," he said. Inside was a job offer reel, printed, official with her name in bold, the title Personal Events Assistant, and a salary that made her knees threaten betrayal. She blinked, rereading it, thinking it was a prank or some twisted punishment, but his expression didn't waver. "I don't understand," she whispered, gripping the paper like a lifeline that might vanish if she blinked too fast. "Why me? Why this?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved behind his desk, poured himself a glass of water with the grace of a man who never rushed, and then finally met her eyes with a gaze that felt less icy today, just tired. "You touched me," he said, and Savannah felt heat crawl up her neck, but his voice softened. "You touched me, and didn't ask for anything. No photo, no favor, no angle, just concern." She didn't know what to say. The words didn't feel like praise, they felt like confession, like vulnerability he rarely allowed to surface. What she didn't know, what he didn't say, was that the last person to touch him without an agenda had destroyed him. That behind his empire stood a graveyard of trust, and somewhere inside him, a thread had snapped when Savannah fell into his life without warning or intention. "You're offering me a job because I accidentally fell on you?" she asked with the flicker of sarcasm she used to shield herself. But he didn't smile. "I'm offering you a job," he replied, "because I trust what I saw in that moment more than I've trusted anything in a long time." The weight of those words stunned her into silence. She wasn't used to being believed in. Most people saw her as invisible, replaceable. But here he was, a man forged in billions in secrets, seeing something in her she wasn't sure she saw in herself. She stared at the contract again, heart pounding, thoughts racing. Was it real? Was it bait? Was it a test? Beckett didn't push. He merely stood, calm as dusk, letting her decide. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "You can walk away, but if you stay, I won't waste your time." There was a strange sincerity in his voice, one that danced between guarded and honest, like a man still afraid to be human. And though every part of Savannah screamed to be cautious, her hands were already folding the offer with the care of someone holding fragile hope. "I'll think about it," she said, even though her heart had already whispered yes. He nodded once, and as she turned to leave, something flickered in his eyes. Not possession, not manipulation, but relief. She paused at the door, glancing back only once, and in that second, neither of them said a word, but everything changed. She walked out with a mind tangled in fear and wonder, unaware that she had just stepped into a story that would rewrite both of their lives. Sewn event, one heartbeat, and one guarded soul at a time. Savannah left Beckett's office with the job in her hands and a storm in her chest, unsure if she had just stepped into her future or walked straight into something designed to break her slowly. But as the days unfolded, her world reshaped itself before she had time to adjust. Mornings now came with silk-lined planners, drivers who knew her name, and emails filled with designer invitations, boardroom briefings, and venue scouting notes. Yet somewhere beneath the glittering surface, she still carried the scent of coffee-stained uniforms and late rent notices in her bones. The opulence of Hale Enterprises was dizzying champagne at brunch meetings, event gowns hand-picked by stylists, private elevator rides that skipped entire floors, and yet Savannah moved through it all with quiet humility, her eyes always scanning the room as if searching for the exit in case everything crumbled again. She never forgot who she was, and Beckett noticed that, though he never said it directly. Instead, he watched her with a sort of fascination, as if trying to remember what it felt like to live without armor. Their professional exchanges grew longer, threaded with subtle glances and unfinished thoughts, the air between them more charged than she dared acknowledge. But with every step closer, the murmurs in the shadows multiplied. Employees whispered when she passed, her name twisted in hushed speculation behind polished glass walls. The poor girl who must be sleeping her way up, the charity case who charmed the boss, and, though she held her chin high, the words still cut when she was alone. More dangerous than office gossip, though, was Miranda Hale Beckett's stepmother, a woman carved from steel and scented with ambition, whose presence at the company boardroom sent shivers down Savannah's spine long before she even knew why. It started subtly casual questions about Savannah's background, her qualifications, her family, the kind of questions disguised as polite conversation but felt more like traps waiting to snap shut. Savannah, curious by nature, began to do her own digging when she realized how carefully Miranda watched her. And in the silent hours after work, she read fragments of old articles, blurred photos, and conflicting stories about Beckett's father's sudden death, the mysterious transfer of power, and the short window during which Miranda held full control of the Hale empire before Beckett claimed it. The deeper Savannah searched, the colder her office became, as if the walls themselves warned her to stop. Beckett noticed her unease, and late one night in the rooftop lounge, when the skyline wrapped around them like stars behind glass, he finally spoke about the ghosts he never let breathe during daylight. He told her how trust had been weaponized in his world, how his father had built the company from nothing, only to die in a boating accident that still raised questions no one dared answer, and how Miranda, grieving widow on the surfaces, whiffly consolidated power, like someone who had rehearsed for it. Savannah listened in silence, feeling his pain settle in the space between them, like a fragile truth too sacred to interrupt. She saw the way his voice changed when he mentioned betrayal, how he stared out into the city as if looking for something he'd lost years ago. He confessed that most people only reached for him with want in their hands, wanting his money, his influence, his name, but with her, it was different. She didn't push. She didn't ask for more than he gave. And because of that, he gave her more than anyone had seen in years. The raw edges, the doubts, the old wounds that never fully closed. And as Savannah sat there beside him, no gowns or glitter between them, just silence and starlight, she felt something shift, not in his gaze, but in her own chest. She realized she wasn't drawn to the mansion, the status, or the sparkle that clung to his life like smoke. She was drawn to him. The man underneath the legacy, the one who carried a fortress around his heart but still looked at her like she was the one thing he didn't know how to guard against. And as the night wore on, and Beckett finally closed his eyes for a moment too long beside her, Savannah knew with terrifying clarity she wasn't just falling, she had already fallen. The night air was still when Savannah left the rooftop lounge, her mind a whirlwind of feelings she hadn't yet dared to name. What started as admiration had spiraled into something terrifyingly close to love. And though neither of them had said it aloud, something between them had shifted irreversibly. She returned to her desk the next morning with a strange warmth in her chest, a quiet certainty that maybe, just maybe, this world wasn't as cruel as she thought, until a voice sliced through the illusion like a jagged knife. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She was retrieving her forgotten planner from a conference room when she heard Miranda's voice drift through the door, left slightly ajar, laced with arrogance and poison. She thinks he hired her because he saw something special? Miranda sneered to whoever was on the other end of the line, her laughter sharp enough to cut. Please. Beckett made a bet with the board. Said he could take any nobody off the street, dress her up, make her fall for him, and drop her before the press caught wind. This one was just easier. The world tilted beneath Savannah's feet. The oxygen left the room. For a moment, everything went silent except for the dull roar in her ears, like the sound of waves crashing far away. Her heart didn't just break, it disintegrated. Her fingertips went cold. Her knees buckled slightly as she backed away from the door like it was made of fire, each step a betrayal of everything she thought she was building. The image of Beckett's eyes softening for her, opening to her, was suddenly tainted, grotesque, like someone had rewritten their story without her consent. Had it all been a performance? Every late-night conversation, every protective glance, every unspoken moment between them, was it all part of a twisted game designed to humiliate her? She wanted to burst into his office, demand the truth, see his face crack with guilt, but the pain wrapped itself around her throat, and instead of fury, there was only silence. Cold, crushing, paralyzing. Savannah walked back to her desk in a trance, eyes glassy, hands shaking, heart a storm she couldn't contain. She packed her few belongings in a slow, methodical haze, as if watching someone else live this nightmare. The woman who had started to believe she could belong here was gone. What remained was a girl once again reminded of her place in a world that never wanted her to rise. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears would come later, when she was alone in her tiny apartment, staring at a future she now had to rewrite. She tore a page from her notepad, the kind with little stars she doodled in the corners when meetings got long, and with a hand that trembled despite her resolve, she wrote just one final message to the man who shattered her faith. You were the one thing I believed in. Goodbye. She folded it once, placed it on his desk without ceremony, and walked out of Hale Tower with no announcement, no dramatic exit, just a heart broken so cleanly it made no sound. The lobby lights seemed colder than usual, the elevator ride longer, the world outside harsher, like it had shifted in her absence. The city moved on around her, oblivious to the girl whose heart had been offered and discarded like an afterthought. She didn't answer her phone, didn't check her email, didn't care if he noticed she was gone. All she could think about was the echo of Miranda's laughter, cruel and triumphant, and the unbearable image of Beckett celebrating a bet she never knew she was part of. That night, in the suffocating quiet of her apartment, Savannah sat on the floor, knees tucked to her chest, staring blankly at the wall as everything she had slowly let herself feel was ripped from her one syllable at a time. She remembered the way he looked at her beneath the stars, the way his voice cracked when he spoke of trust, and now those memories felt like lies dressed in sincerity. It wasn't just betrayal, it was emotional theft. She had given him her belief, and he'd gambled it for sport. And in that crushing silence, she made a vow to herself not to cry for him, not to chase answers, not to beg for the truth. She would rebuild, but this time, with thicker walls and no doors left open. The days slipped by like rain on windows, quiet and cold. And though the city pulsed with noise and motion, Savannah's world became still. She didn't return calls, didn't reply to emails, didn't open her curtains until noon. Her heart had turned into something cautious, wrapped in silence. And the girl who once looked up with wonder now kept her gaze low, building a new rhythm in the quiet hills of Vermont, where no one whispered behind glass walls or laughed into phone calls about things that break people. She painted murals for children at a local community center, using colors to say things her voice no longer trusted, her hands coaxing joy from concrete while the world she left behind tried to forget her name. Yet far from the headlines and high rises, Savannah found herself healing in pieces, feeding stray animals that came to trust her, planting wildflowers by the riverbank, and filling old notebooks with dreams she once abandoned. She told no one where she'd gone, and that was the point. She didn't want to be found. But Beckett Hale had never stopped searching. The man the world believed unshakable became restless in her absence. No press releases, no headlines, just sleepless nights, canceled meetings, and a voice he kept replaying in his mind. "You were the one thing I believed in. Goodbye." He'd read that note 100 times, each word a weight on his soul. And when his search finally led him to a whisper of a festival in a small town miles away from power and pretense, he came without his driver, without his suit, just a heart scraped raw and hope wearing thin. He spotted her before she saw him, her hair tied back loosely, her jeans streaked with paint, barefoot on the grass as she laughed softly with a little boy who handed her a flower with sticky fingers. She looked nothing like the woman from the ballroom, but she was more radiant than ever. When she finally turned and saw him, the world didn't stop, but her breath did. She froze, paintbrush still in hand, her lashes dusted with disbelief, and something too soft to name. Beckett stepped forward, his voice unsteady for the first time in years. "I never made a bet," he said, not rehearsed, not smooth, just honest. "It was Miranda." She twisted it. "I hired you because you were the first person who touched me without breaking me." The wind moved between them gently, rustling the leaves as if nature itself held its breath. Savannah didn't speak, not because she didn't have words, but because none of them could carry the storm inside her, not without breaking. Her eyes shimmered, full of things unsaid, and the tears that danced at the edge of her lashes weren't out of pain, but the release of weeks spent in silence. He didn't rush her. He stepped closer, careful, like approaching something sacred. "I don't want the company," he said, voice low. "I don't want the board, the business, or the spotlight. I want you, Savannah Quinn, the woman who made silence feel safe." His words weren't grand, but they held the weight of everything he'd carried since she left. And as the sky turned lavender above them, bruised with stars and whispering wind, she reached out, not with caution, but with forgiveness blooming in her fingers. And when they kissed, it wasn't desperate or dramatic. It was soft, real, slow, like the rebuilding of something once shattered. His hand cradled her cheek like a question, and her lips answered without words. There were no cameras, no suits, no audience, just two wounded souls standing beneath an open sky, choosing each other not out of perfection, but in spite of their scars. It was the kind of kiss that didn't need promises, just presence. The kind that didn't seek to possess, only to honor. And in that moment, neither of them was Hale Enterprises or the girl who spilled wine, just Beckett and Savannah, breathing in the fragile, powerful truth that love, real love, didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be brave. But even in the quiet after love is found, there are those who feed on destruction. And while Beckett and Savannah breathed under starlight, miles away, Miranda Hale burned with a rage colder than ice, watching her empire slip through her fingers as the man she once manipulated broke free from her grip hand. Worse, did it for a woman she deemed disposable. Her fury didn't come with screaming, but strategy. With one whisper to the press, she ignited a storm-leaked footage. Private moments taken from security cameras twisted out of context, fragments of truth edited into tabloid poison. Headlines screamed, "Betrayal." Blogs spat venom. Savannah's face was splashed across media outlets, with captions like "Gold Digger Goddess" and "From Waitress to Wrecker." Anonymous sources, likely fed by Miranda's hand, painted Savannah as a master manipulator who seduced her way into Hale Enterprises to destroy it from within. Beckett, once seen as the untouchable mogul, became a cautionary tale overnight an elite blinded by lust, mocked for falling for a girl from the gutter. The board panicked, issuing back-channel ultimatums. Investors began to pull. Sponsors threatened lawsuits. And through it all, Savannah sat in the apartment Beckett rented for Herselant, sick with guilt, aching not for the headlines, but for the look in his eyes when he read them. She begged him to walk away from her, to fix what could be salvaged, to let her disappear again for his sake. But Beckett didn't flinch. He held her hands, those same paint-stained hands he fell in love with, and simply said, "If I abandon you to protect a lie, then I was never the man you believed in." The next day, he arrived at the Hale Enterprises press conference keynote in a suit, but in an open shirt, sleeves rolled, eyes unafraid, Savannah at his side with her head held high. Cameras flashed like lightning strikes, and gasps rippled through the audience when he reached for the McNaught with spin, but truth. "If loving someone genuine is a scandal," he said, voice steady, gaze locked on every lens, "then let it be my legacy." And just like that, he stepped down. No negotiation, no hesitation. Beckett Hale, the man born into fortune, walked away from the company his family bled for not because he was weak, but because power meant nothing if it cost him love. The board sat in stunned silence. Miranda, watching from behind her fortress of bitterness, realized too late that she'd played the wrong game. Beckett sold his shares by morning and announced the launch of the Hale Foundation, named not for himself, but for the father whose integrity Miranda had tried to erase. The foundation's mission? To dismantle corporate corruption, hold abusers of power accountable, and rebuild broken communities across the country, starting with the very systems Miranda once exploited. Its first employee, standing at the heart of the launch event, wasn't a celebrity or a financial advisor. It was Savannah Quinn, former waitress, mural artist, and the woman who proved love wasn't weakness but revolution. Cameras still followed them, but the narrative had shifted, not a scandal, but a reckoning. And for the first time, their story wasn't being written by media hands or boardroom puppets. It was theirs. A year passed, not in silence, but in rebuilding, in moments quiet and loud, in days where they woke beside each other, not wondering what might break, but feeling what was whole. And so, when the sun rose on that summer morning behind Savannah's childhood home, there was no orchestra, no headlines, no monogrammed aisle, just the rustle of leaves, the smell of fresh-cut grass, and two souls who had finally chosen each other, not through drama, but through every painful, beautiful moment that had led them here. Beckett stood under the canopy of oak trees with his sleeves rolled and his hair slightly wind-tousled. Not the billionaire in polished armor, but simply a man who traded titles for truth. His eyes soft as they watched Savannah approach barefoot down the petal-lined path, wearing a simple white cotton dress that clung to the summer breeze like poetry. There were no diamonds, no designer shoes, no crowd of strangers watching, just their closest family and a few friends, the people who had stayed through storms in silence. And as she stepped closer, holding a bouquet of wildflowers picked that morning from her mother's garden, the air seemed to hush in reverence, no because of what they wore or where they stood, but because of what they had become. The officiant's voice faded into the background, because the only thing either of them heard was the sound of each other breathing. The rhythm that had once been chaos now softened into calm. Their vows weren't crafted by poets or speechwriters. They were pieces of their story, golden truths laced with scars and healing, whispered like promises between pages of a book they were still writing. Beckett's voice trembled as he spoke first, not out of fear but reverence. In a world full of cold hands and loud lies, you were warmth. You were truth. You touched me without asking for anything, and in doing so, you gave me everything. Savannah's lips curved into a tearful smile as she replied, "You didn't save me, Beckett. You saw me. And that gave me the strength to save myself." The crowd around them, small, sincere, wrapped in linen and laughter, included faces that once felt lost to time. Beckett's estranged younger sister, Marin, whom Savannah had tracked down and helped mend decades of wounds with gentle letters and quiet understanding, stood beside her new fiancé, eyes glossy with pride. Even some former Hale employees, those Beckett once thought had turned away, had come, now working under the foundation that breathed hope into communities instead of hoarding wealth. The Hale name had changed not through press statements or stock prices, but by becoming a symbol of accountability, of evolution, of second chances given and taken with grace. As twilight kissed the horizon and the first stars appeared like blessings above, the ceremony gave way to laughter and dancing beneath strings of glowing bulbs, hung between trees by Savannah's brothers and childhood friends. There was no stage, no chandeliers, just music humming from old speakers, and the heartbeat of a field filled with people who understood love wasn't spectacle, it was sanctuary. Beckett didn't lead her in a practice waltz. He simply held her close, their steps unsure and perfect, as if the ground had been made only for them. She rested her head against his chest. Where once there had only been armor and silence, now there was breath and belonging. And as the sky deepened to velvet and fireflies blinked like tiny blessings, Savannah leaned in, her voice barely a whisper over the hum of the night. "That one mistake," she murmured, lips grazing his jaw, "was the best accident of my life." Beckett pulled her in tighter, forehead against hers, not needing to say it back, because she already knew his entire being was the answer. Around them, people laughed. Children ran through the grass with sparklers, and plates of peach pie disappeared from paper plates. But for them, time folded inward. There were no reporters here, no stockholders, no ghosts, only two people who had bled and broken and still chosen to love again. And as the last song played and their friends formed a circle around them with candles and humming voices, Savannah and Beckett stood in the center, not as headlines, not as royalty of any empire, but as something far more rare. Two people who had learned that love wasn't found in the absence of pain, but in the refusal to let pain steal your softness. Their kiss beneath the stars that night wasn't just celebration, it was resurrection, a promise, a quiet triumph written not in gold, but in grace.